Darkness wrapped around Ethan Carter like a heavy, suffocating blanket. His head throbbed as consciousness returned in jagged waves, each pulse of pain reminding him that something had gone terribly wrong. The last thing he remembered was the sky. Vast, endless, streaked with fire as his fighter jet spiraled out of control. A blinding flash, a deafening explosion. Then, nothing. Now, as his eyes fluttered open, he was met with an unnatural glow. A dim, bluish light emanating from smooth, curved walls that stretched high above him. The air was thick with an unfamiliar scent, something metallic and sterile, laced with an almost electric sharpness. He tried to move, but his limbs felt leaden, weighed down by restraints that hummed faintly against his skin. Panic surged through him, but he forced himself to stay still, to assess, to think. This wasn't a military facility. It wasn't a hospital. It wasn't anything human. A sound, barely perceptible at first, grew into a rhythmic hum, like the purring of some massive machine. Then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate, approaching with eerie precision. Ethan tensed. Every instinct in his body screamed danger. A shadow passed over him, and then he saw them. The being towered over him, at least 7 feet tall, its skin a deep sapphire blue that shimmered under the cold light. Its features were angular, otherworldly, with elongated golden eyes that seemed to peer straight through him. A heavy, intricate garment draped over its shoulders, adorned with patterns that pulsed faintly, as if alive. It observed him in silence for a long moment before speaking. "You are awake," it said, its voice smooth, almost melodic, but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. Ethan clenched his jaw. The voice was impossibly clear, not distorted by any accent or mechanical interference. It was as if the creature spoke his language naturally, effortlessly. "Where am I?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. "Who the hell are you?" The being did not answer immediately. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as if considering its response. Then, with measured calm, it spoke again. "You were recovered from the wreckage of your craft," it said. "You are aboard our vessel." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Your vessel," he echoed. "Which means, I'm not on Earth anymore." There was no confirmation, but the silence was answer enough. A cold dread settled in his stomach. "I am Exelfar," the being continued, "commander of the Virex Dominion. And you, Colonel Ethan Carter, are now our prisoner." Prisoner. The word struck him like a physical blow, but he refused to let his expression betray his fear. Years of military training had conditioned him for the unexpected, but nothing had prepared him for this. "How do you know my name?" he asked, his mind racing through possibilities. Had they intercepted military transmissions, hacked classified databases, extracted information directly from his unconscious mind? Zelthar's golden gaze did not waver. "We know much about your kind." There was something unsettling about the way he said it, a depth of understanding that went beyond mere reconnaissance. Ethan fought against the restraints again, testing their strength. They did not budge. "Why am I here?" he demanded. Zelthar took a slow step forward. "That," he said, "is what we are still determining." Ethan's fists clenched. "You shot me down." The alien commander gave a slight nod. "Your aircraft entered restricted airspace." Restricted airspace. Ethan almost laughed, but there was no humor in his voice. "I was flying over the Pacific. That's Earth's territory." Zelthar regarded him for a moment before responding. "Earth is no longer yours alone." Ethan felt the weight of those words settle over him like a crushing tide. No longer yours alone. It wasn't just an abduction. It wasn't just a crashed jet. This was something bigger. Much bigger. A movement in the background caught his eye. Another figure had entered the room. Slimmer, shorter than Zelthar, with the same deep blue skin but softer, less rigid features. This one's golden eyes lacked the hard, authoritative edge of the commander's. Instead, they held something else, something almost curious. She stepped closer, hesitated, then spoke in the same flawless English. "He is not what we expected," she murmured. Zelthar's gaze flickered toward her before returning to Ethan. There was a long-waited pause. Then, without explanation, he turned to leave. "Wait." Ethan started, but the restraints tightened at the slightest movement, sending a pulse of energy through his limbs. He gritted his teeth against the sensation. The female hesitated again, as if debating whether to say something more. Then, just as she turned to follow Zelthar, she whispered one last thing, so softly that Ethan almost thought he imagined it. "There is more to you than you know." The doors slid shut behind them, sealing Ethan inside with nothing but the hum of alien technology and the echo of her cryptic words. Ethan Carter had been trained to assess threats, to recognize patterns, to anticipate his enemy's next move. But nothing in his years as a fighter pilot, nothing in all the classified military briefings he had ever sat through, had prepared him for this. He was trapped aboard an alien vessel, bound to a chair that hummed with some kind of energy restraint, and interrogated by creatures whose very existence defied everything the world believed about extraterrestrial contact. The weight of the unknown pressed down on him, heavier than the gravity of Earth. He suddenly longed for. Time passed in an agonizing crawl. He had no way of knowing if it had been minutes, hours, or days since the blue-skinned commander, Zelthar, had left him alone. The sterile, metallic walls of his cell pulsed faintly, as if they were alive, reacting to his presence. The only sound was the low, rhythmic hum of the ship's systems, an eerie, ever-present vibration that settled into his bones. The words of the female alien echoed in his mind. "There is more to you than you know." What the hell did that mean? He tested the restraints again. They weren't just physical bonds. They responded to his movement, tightening each time he struggled, sending a low charge of energy through his muscles. Not enough to cause real pain, but enough to discourage him from trying too hard. The technology was beyond anything Earth had. Advanced, intelligent, lethal. He exhaled sharply, forcing his mind to stay sharp. Panic was useless. He had to understand the situation before he could plan his next move. Then, without warning, the restraints disengaged. A faint hiss filled the room as the energy bands flickered and disappeared. Ethan didn't hesitate. He shot to his feet, muscles screaming from the hours, or days, of confinement. His heart pounded as he scanned the room. There were no guards, no visible exits, just smooth metallic walls that curved seamlessly into the ceiling. Then one of the walls shifted. A thin seam appeared, widening into a doorway that hadn't existed a second before. Beyond it stood the female alien. She looked different now. The hesitation in her golden eyes was gone, replaced with something more decisive. "You need to come with me," she said. Ethan didn't move. "Why?" "Because if you stay here, you will die." That got his attention. He eyed her warily. "I thought I was a prisoner." "You were." She glanced down the hallway, as if checking for something. "But things have changed." Ethan's body tensed. "What changed?" Her jaw tightened. "The council has voted to eliminate you." His blood ran cold. "What?" She took a step closer, urgency in every movement. "There is a faction among us that believes humans are a threat to the balance of the galaxy. They were divided on what to do with you, but after learning more about you," she hesitated, "they decided you cannot be allowed to live." Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears. "Why? What do they know about me that I don't?" She opened her mouth to respond, but then stopped, shaking her head. "There's no time. I can get you off this ship, but we have to leave now." He stared at her. Everything in his training told him not to trust her. She was still an alien, still one of them. But what choice did he have? Stay and be executed by creatures who saw him as a threat, or take his chances with the one who might be telling the truth. His instincts screamed at him, but something deeper, something unfamiliar, pushed him forward. "Fine," he said. "Let's go." She turned and led him through the doorway into a corridor bathed in soft blue light. The walls pulsed rhythmically, and the air had a strange weight to it, like it was charged with unseen energy. Ethan kept his movements controlled, his mind cataloging every detail, every possible escape route. "What's your name?" he asked. She glanced at him, surprised. "Lyra." "Okay, Lyra," he said. "Tell me why you're helping me." She didn't answer immediately. They moved quickly through the hallway, the faint hum of the ship seeming to grow louder. Then, in a quiet voice, she said, "Because I don't believe in killing something just because we fear it." That wasn't the answer he expected. They turned a corner, and suddenly Lyra froze. She pressed a hand against his chest, pushing him back into the shadows. Ethan tensed, following her gaze. Two towering figures stood ahead, clad in metallic armor that shimmered like liquid silver. Their elongated heads turned toward each other, their voices carrying a sharp, rhythmic cadence Ethan couldn't understand. They were guards, armed, blocking the path forward. Lyra's golden eyes darted to a panel on the wall. She whispered, "Stay close." She reached out, her fingers brushing over the surface of the panel in a precise pattern. A second later, the lights in the corridor flickered, and a low vibration rumbled beneath their feet. The guards stiffened, their heads snapping toward the ceiling as if listening to something unseen. Then, without hesitation, they turned and sprinted in the opposite direction. Ethan exhaled. "What did you just do?" "I rerouted a security alert," she said. "They think there's a breach in the engineering sector." "Smart," he admitted. "But they're going to figure it out soon." She nodded. "That's why we need to move." They slipped past the empty corridor, their footsteps barely making a sound against the smooth metallic surface. The ship was enormous, larger than any aircraft carrier Ethan had ever seen. The deeper they went, the more he noticed the strange, organic nature of the walls, like the ship itself was alive. Finally, they reached another sealed door. Lyra placed her hand against a panel, and it slid open with a soft hiss. Inside was a small chamber lined with what looked like sleek, streamlined pods. Escape vessels. Lyra hurried to one and activated its control panel. The smooth exterior shifted, revealing an open hatch. She turned to him. "This will take you back to your world." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "And what about you?" She hesitated. I can't go with you." His jaw clenched. "Why not?" Lyra looked away. "If I leave, they'll know I helped you. They'll hunt me." Something in her voice made him pause. She was risking everything by doing this. And yet, she was staying behind. Ethan took a slow breath, stepping closer. "Why do this at all?" She met his gaze. "Because I know who you are." A chill ran through him. "And who is that?" Her expression softened, but there was something else in her eyes now, something close to sadness. "You're not just a soldier, Ethan Carter," she said. "You're something more." Before he could demand an explanation, a deafening alarm blared through the ship. The walls pulsed with red light, and a voice, deep, commanding, echoed through the corridors. "Security breach detected. Intruder containment in progress." Lyra's eyes widened. "They found us. You have to go. Now." Ethan hesitated for only a second before climbing into the pod. The hatch began to close, sealing him inside. Through the glass, he saw Lyra step back, her golden eyes locked onto his. Then, with a sudden jolt, the pod detached. The ship's interior blurred into streaks of light as he was hurled into the vast emptiness of space. The escape pod shuddered violently as it hurtled through space. Ethan's stomach twisted from the rapid descent, his mind still racing to process what had just happened. The last thing he saw before the hatch sealed was Lyra's golden eyes, filled with something close to regret. Then the ship had vanished from sight, swallowed by the endless black void. Now he was alone, strapped into the pod seat as stars streaked past the reinforced glass. A series of holographic displays flickered in front of him, symbols and data scrolling in an alien language he couldn't decipher. The pod had clearly been designed for a Virex occupant, not a human. He was at the mercy of its programming, hurtling toward Earth at speeds that defied every law of physics he understood. The console beeped, and a calm, artificial voice filled the cabin. Course locked. Re-entry commencing. Ethan braced himself as the pod veered sharply, angling toward the familiar blue and green sphere in the distance. Earth. His home. But something felt wrong. Lyra had said he was more than just a soldier, that the Council feared him enough to order his execution. Why? What did they know that he didn't? The heat shields activated, glowing red-hot as the pod pierced through the planet's upper atmosphere. The vibrations intensified, rattling his bones, and the view outside became a blur of flames and streaking clouds. Then, suddenly, impact. The world around him exploded in force as the pod crashed down, tearing through dense vegetation before slamming to a halt. Dust and debris filled the cabin, and for a few agonizing moments, silence stretched around him. Then came the pain. Ethan groaned as he unbuckled himself, feeling the deep ache of bruises forming beneath his skin. He forced the hatch open, coughing as fresh air rushed in. It was damp, thick with the scent of soil and rain. Slowly, he pulled himself out, boots sinking into the soft earth. A jungle. He was in a jungle. The dense canopy above blocked out most of the sky, letting in only slivers of light. Towering trees surrounded him, their massive trunks wrapped in vines. The air buzzed with the hum of unseen insects, and the distant calls of unfamiliar wildlife echoed through the undergrowth. Wherever he had landed, it was remote, far from civilization. Ethan took a shaky breath, instincts kicking in. First priority. Assess the situation. His pod was intact, but likely broadcasting a signal. If the Virex were tracking him, it wouldn't take long before they found this location. He had to move. He scanned the wreckage, searching for anything useful. Inside the pod, he found a small device, a sleek handheld scanner that flickered with Virex symbols. He didn't understand the language, but when he pressed a button, a holographic map appeared, displaying his location. Coordinates. He was somewhere in the Amazon rainforest. The realization sent a fresh wave of anxiety through him. If he had landed in the Amazon, that meant no immediate rescue, no roads, no nearby bases. It could take days, weeks, to reach civilization on foot. But something told him he didn't have that long. A rustling sound broke through the silence. Ethan froze, his pulse quickening. It wasn't the wind. Something was moving in the undergrowth. He spun around just in time to see a shadow dart between the trees. Not an animal. Someone, or something, was watching him. Ethan clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. He wasn't unarmed. The Virex scanner might have more than just mapping capabilities, and if it came down to it, he still had his fists and military training. But against what? He had no idea what he was dealing with. Then, from the darkness, a voice. Ethan Carter. His breath caught in his throat. The voice was deep, layered, as if two beings were speaking at once. He turned slowly, every muscle in his body coiled for a fight. A figure emerged from the trees. It was humanoid, but not human. Nearly 8 feet tall, with dark, metallic skin that shimmered like liquid steel. Its eyes burned with an eerie white glow, and intricate patterns of light pulsed along its arms and chest, as if its body was a conduit for energy. Ethan didn't move. He couldn't. The creature took another step forward, tilting its head slightly. You are, as they said, strong, resilient. Ethan swallowed. Who the hell are you? The being regarded him for a long moment before responding. We are the ones who have been waiting. A cold chill ran down his spine. Waiting for what? The being's glowing eyes narrowed. For your awakening. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. What are you talking about? The figure stepped closer, and despite his training, Ethan took a step back. The air around the creature seemed to hum with an unseen force, distorting the space near its body. "You are not what you believe yourself to be," it said. "You are not merely human." Ethan's fists clenched. "That's what Lyra said. What does it mean?" The being studied him, then lifted a hand. A surge of energy crackled between its fingers, forming a swirling mass of white fire that pulsed with an unnatural intensity. "This," it said, "is the power of your ancestors." Ethan's stomach twisted. "I don't understand." The being let the energy dissipate. "You will. Soon." Ethan's mind raced. Ancestors. Power. None of this made sense. He was a soldier, a pilot, just a man. There was nothing special about him. And yet, something deep inside him stirred. Memories. Faint. Flickering. A feeling of something long buried. Something he had always dismissed as dreams or imagination. His mother's voice, whispering stories to him as a child. Tales of warriors who wielded fire, who could bend the fabric of reality itself. A legacy passed down through generations. But they were just stories, weren't they? The being took another step forward. "You have been hidden for too long, Ethan Carter. But now, the Virex know, and they will come for you." Ethan swallowed hard. He had spent his life thinking he knew who he was. But now, as he stood in the heart of an ancient jungle, face to face with something beyond his understanding, one terrifying thought clawed its way into his mind. He wasn't just a soldier. He was something more. And if the Virex feared him, then they knew exactly what he was capable of, even if he didn't. Yet, Ethan stood frozen, staring at the alien figure before him. The jungle around them seemed unnaturally quiet, as if the very air held its breath, waiting for something to happen. The metallic-skinned being radiated an energy he could feel in his bones, a pulse of power that made the hair on his arms stand on end. "You're going to have to start making sense," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I don't have time for riddles." The being's glowing white eyes bore into him. "Time is the one thing you do not have." Ethan clenched his jaw. "Then start talking." The being tilted its head slightly, as if measuring him, deciding how much to reveal. Then, without warning, it lifted its hand and snapped its fingers. The world around Ethan changed in an instant. The jungle, the trees, the sky, everything vanished. Instead, he was standing in an endless black void, streaked with swirling lights that looked like distant galaxies. The ground beneath him felt solid, yet he could see through it, as if he were floating in space itself. Ethan's heart pounded. "What the hell?" "This is a memory," the being interrupted. "Not yours, but one that belongs to your kind." Ethan turned, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Then figures began to emerge from the darkness. Warriors, tall, armored beings, unlike anything he had ever seen. Some looked human, others were different. Their eyes glowed with the same eerie light as the being before him. Their bodies radiated power, raw and untamed. They moved with a grace and strength that defied physics, wielding weapons that crackled with energy. Then the scene shifted. A battlefield. A world engulfed in flames, torn apart by war. Ethan's breath caught as he saw the Virex. Hordes of them, descending like a swarm, their ships blotting out the sky. The warriors fought back, unleashing devastating energy, but they were outnumbered. One by one, they fell. The vision pulsed, and suddenly Ethan was looking at something else. Someone else. A man. He was human, or at least he looked human. He stood at the center of the battlefield, arms outstretched, his entire body glowing with raw power. The Virex surrounded him, their weapons trained on him. But he didn't run. He didn't need to. Ethan watched in stunned silence as the man unleashed a wave of energy so intense it shattered the ground beneath him. Virex ships exploded midair. Soldiers were thrown back like ragdolls. The battlefield itself seemed to ripple under the force of his power. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the vision ended. Ethan gasped as he found himself back in the jungle, his knees weak, sweat dripping down his brow. He staggered back, his mind struggling to process what he had just seen. The being watched him carefully. "Now do you understand?" Ethan's hands trembled. "That man, who was he?" The being was silent for a long moment before answering. "He was your ancestor." Ethan shook his head. "No, that's impossible." The being took a step forward. "You have always felt different, haven't you?" Ethan didn't answer. "You've survived things others couldn't. You've done things that defied logic. You've always had an instinct for battle, for survival, beyond what is natural." Ethan clenched his fists. "That doesn't mean I'm whatever that was." The being exhaled, almost as if it was disappointed. "Denial will not change the truth." Ethan turned away, trying to focus. This was insane. He was just a soldier, a pilot, nothing more. He wasn't some warrior from an ancient war. He wasn't some descendant of superpowered beings. But deep down, a small part of him wondered. The memories, the feelings he had ignored his entire life, the dreams that had haunted him since childhood, dreams of fire, of battle, of something inside him clawing to be released. "What do the Rewrotes want from me?" Ethan finally asked. The being's expression darkened. "They want to erase your existence." Ethan frowned. "Why?" "Because your blood carries something ancient, something powerful. You are the last of a forgotten lineage, a lineage that once threatened their rule." Ethan let out a sharp breath. "You're saying I'm supposed to fight them? Alone?" The being's glowing eyes studied him. "Not alone." Ethan frowned. "What does that mean?" Before the being could answer, a distant explosion rocked the jungle. Birds scattered from the treetops. The ground vibrated beneath Ethan's feet. The Rewrotes had found him. The being's expression remained calm. "It has begun." Ethan felt his heart rate spike. "We need to move." The being nodded. "Follow me." They sprinted through the dense jungle, weaving between massive trees and leaping over thick roots. The air was thick with humidity, sweat clinging to Ethan's skin. He could hear the distant hum of Rewrote drones scanning the area, their mechanical voices cutting through the wilderness. They weren't just searching, they were hunting. As they ran, Ethan felt something shift inside him, a strange sensation, like a dormant part of him was beginning to stir. His breath came easier, his legs moved faster, his body responded in ways it never had before, as if an unseen force was guiding him. Then, the first Rewrote soldier appeared. It burst through the foliage, a towering figure of sleek black armor, its glowing red eyes locking onto Ethan in an instant. It raised a weapon, something long and metallic, pulsating with energy. Ethan didn't think. He moved, faster than he should have been able to. His body twisted, reacting before his mind could process the threat. The Rewrotes fired, but Ethan was already gone, diving to the side with inhuman speed. He hit the ground, rolled, and came up swinging. His fist connected with the soldier's armored chest. There was a flash of energy, an explosion of force that sent the Rewrotes flying backward, crashing into a tree so hard the trunk splintered. Ethan staggered back, staring at his own hands. His heart pounded. That wasn't normal. That wasn't possible. The being beside him watched with a knowing gaze. "You are awakening." Ethan swallowed hard, adrenaline coursing through his veins. For the first time in his life, he felt it, the power inside him, and he had a feeling this was only the beginning. The jungle was alive with chaos. The sound of distant explosions echoed through the dense canopy, shaking the ground beneath Ethan's feet. The air was thick with the scent of burning foliage and ionized energy, the unmistakable signature of Rewrote weaponry. Somewhere beyond the trees, their forces were closing in, their relentless pursuit cutting through the jungle like a wildfire. Ethan's mind raced as he stood over the fallen Rewrote soldier, his chest rising and falling in sharp, rapid breaths. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had just sent a fully armored Rewrote flying through the air with a single punch. It wasn't possible. It shouldn't have been possible. And yet he had felt it, an energy surging through him, raw and untamed, as if something deep inside him had finally been unleashed. The alien being beside him, his mysterious guide, watched him with an unreadable expression, its glowing eyes reflecting the faint embers of the destruction around them. "You are beginning to understand," it said, its voice calm despite the chaos. Ethan clenched his fists. "I don't understand anything. I shouldn't have been able to do that." The being took a step forward, placing a metallic hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Your blood carries the power of your ancestors. It has always been within you, waiting." Ethan shook his head, frustration mounting. "I'm just a soldier, a pilot. This." He gestured to the unconscious Virex sprawled against the broken tree. "This isn't who I am." The being's gaze didn't waver. Denial does not change what is real. Before Ethan could respond, a distant, inhuman screech pierced the air. He turned sharply toward the sound, his instincts flaring. "They have found us," the being said. "No more talking." They had to move. Ethan sprinted after his companion, his body still buzzing with energy. His movements felt sharper, more precise, almost like he was seeing the world differently. The jungle blurred around him as his speed increased, the wind whipping against his skin. Another explosion rocked the trees to their right, sending a shockwave through the ground. Ethan skidded to a stop, turning just in time to see 3 Virex soldiers step through the smoke. Their armor gleamed under the scattered sunlight, their glowing red eyes locking onto him. One of them raised a weapon, its barrel pulsing with blue energy. Ethan moved before he even thought. In a single breath, he lunged forward, closing the distance between them in the blink of an eye. The Virex soldier barely had time to react before Ethan's fist connected with its chest. Another surge of force exploded from his knuckles, sending the alien flying backward like a ragdoll. The second Virex swung its weapon, attempting to strike him. Ethan ducked, his reflexes unnaturally fast, then grabbed the soldier by the arm and twisted. There was a sickening crack as the armor bent under his grip, and he threw the Virex into the third soldier with effortless strength. He took a step back, breathing hard. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just enhanced reflexes or adrenaline. This was something else entirely. He turned to the being. "Tell me what's happening to me now." The being nodded. "Your body is remembering what it was meant to be." "Meant to be," Ethan repeated. "You are not just human, Ethan Carter. You are the descendant of warriors who once stood against the Virex. Your bloodline was nearly erased, but you survived. And now your power is returning." Ethan exhaled sharply. "And what exactly am I supposed to do with it?" The being's eyes burned with an intensity that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. "You must fight." Before Ethan could respond, the jungle erupted with movement. More Virex were closing in, dozens of them, their sleek, armored bodies weaving through the trees with terrifying speed. They were faster this time, more coordinated, their weapons primed and ready. There were too many. Even with his newfound abilities, Ethan knew he couldn't take them all on. "Not yet. We have to go," the being said, stepping beside him. "Now." Ethan hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Lead the way." They sprinted through the jungle, moving faster than should have been possible. Ethan could hear the Virex behind them, closing the distance with every second. His muscles burned, his pulse pounded, but something deep inside him pushed him forward, driving him beyond his limits. Then, up ahead, light. The dense trees gave way to an open clearing, a sheer drop at the edge of a massive cliffside. Below, a rushing river cut through the landscape, its waters twisting through jagged rocks. It was a dead end. Ethan skidded to a stop at the cliff's edge, glancing back. The Virex were almost upon them, their weapons glowing with lethal energy. His mind raced. There was no way out. Unless. The being stepped beside him, its gaze fixed on the river below. "Trust yourself," it said. Ethan clenched his jaw. He didn't have a choice. With a deep breath, he took a step back, then jumped. The wind howled around him as he plummeted, the roaring water rushing toward him at terrifying speed. For a split second, fear gripped his chest. But then, something shifted. The air around him seemed to bend. His body felt lighter. And then, impossibly, he slowed. Not completely, but enough. He hit the water with force, but not enough to break bones. The river swallowed him whole, dragging him into its depths before spitting him back to the surface. He gasped for air, his lungs burning, and fought against the current. A second later, the being emerged beside him, completely unfazed. Ethan paddled toward the shore, his limbs aching as he pulled himself onto solid ground. He collapsed onto the wet rocks, breathing hard. His companion stepped onto the shore with effortless grace, staring down at him. "You are beginning to tap into your abilities." Ethan let out a rough laugh. "I just survived a 70-foot drop. I'm not sure if that's skill or luck." The being tilted its head. It was neither. Ethan pushed himself up, shaking the water from his hair. "So what now?" The being turned, staring at the horizon. "Now we prepare. The Virex will not stop hunting you." Ethan followed its gaze, his mind still racing with everything that had happened. The power inside him, the truth about who he was, it was all too much. But one thing was certain. He wasn't just running anymore. He was fighting back. And for the first time, the Virex had something to fear. Ethan sat on the rocky shore, his body aching, his mind struggling to process everything that had happened. The river still roared behind him, its current twisting and thrashing against the jagged rocks. The jungle stretched endlessly ahead, dense and dark, a perfect hiding place for both predator and prey. He ran a hand through his wet hair, his fingers shaking. The weight of the moment pressed against him. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be anything special. He had spent his entire life as a soldier, following orders, surviving by instinct. But now the universe had thrust something onto him that he wasn't sure he could carry. The being stood beside him, watching with those ever-glowing white eyes. It was patient, unmoving, as if time itself was meaningless to it. "You're expecting me to just accept all of this," Ethan finally said, his voice rough. The being remained silent for a moment before responding. "I expect you to survive." Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, I've been doing plenty of that lately." "You were chosen for a reason." Ethan shook his head. "I wasn't chosen. I was born, and that's not the same thing." The being studied him. "You misunderstand. You were not merely born with power, you were shaped by it, even before you knew it existed. Your path has always led here." Ethan exhaled sharply. "Then tell me something. If I really am what you say, if I'm supposed to be this last descendant of some long-forgotten warriors, why the hell am I only feeling it now?" The being's gaze didn't waver. "Because you were never meant to awaken alone." Something in Ethan's chest tightened. He had spent his whole life believing he was alone. No family, no legacy, just another soldier lost in the chaos of war. But now, this thing was telling him that he had always belonged to something bigger, something ancient, something the Virex feared. "They'll keep coming, won't they?" Ethan asked, already knowing the answer. The being nodded. "Until you are dead, or until they are." Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment. The memories of battle, of near-death experiences, of the strength he had just begun to tap into, all of it swirled inside him like a storm. No more running, no more hiding. When he opened his eyes again, there was something different in them, a steel-hard resolve. "Then we need to stop them first." The being inclined its head, almost approvingly. "You are ready to learn." Ethan stood, his muscles stiff from exhaustion, but there was a new energy humming beneath his skin. He could feel it in his bones, in his blood. The jungle around them seemed more alive than before, like his senses had sharpened. "What exactly am I supposed to do?" he asked. The being gestured toward the dense jungle. "Come." Ethan followed, moving through the underbrush with a speed and grace that surprised even himself. The further they went, the more he felt the pulse of something deep inside him, like an ember flickering, waiting to ignite. They came to a clearing, and the being finally stopped. "This place," it said, "will be where you remember who you are." Ethan scanned the area. It was an open space, surrounded by towering trees. The ground was firm, smooth. The air was heavy with something he couldn't quite name. Energy, maybe, or something deeper. "Train me," he said. The being stepped forward. "You must first understand your own nature. Your ancestors were not simply stronger or faster. They were attuned to something greater, something beyond the physical. That is what makes them dangerous." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "So what do I do?" The being extended its arm, palm up. A faint ripple of energy shimmered around it. "Feel the energy inside you. Do not force it. Let it rise." Ethan stared at the being's hand, then at his own. He curled his fingers into a fist, searching for the power he had felt before, the force that had thrown a Virex soldier across the jungle. Nothing. His jaw clenched. "I don't feel anything." "You are thinking too much. It is not about control. It is about understanding." Ethan closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe. He focused, searching for the ember inside him. He had felt it before, hadn't he? When he fought, when he ran, when his instincts took over. Something flickered inside him, but it was faint, distant. He exhaled in frustration. "This isn't working." The being watched him carefully. "Because you are afraid." Ethan tensed. "I'm not afraid. You are." The words struck something deep inside him. "I have spent my whole life fighting," Ethan said through gritted teeth. "I have faced death more times than I can count, and I have never run from it." The being stepped closer. "And yet, you fear yourself." Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. Because deep down, a part of him knew the being was right. He wasn't afraid of the Virex. He was afraid of what he might become. The being studied him for a long moment. Then, without warning, it raised its hand and struck. Ethan barely had time to react before a wave of invisible force hit him square in the chest, sending him sprawling backward. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. He rolled onto his hands and knees, coughing. "What the hell?" "You must let go," the being said, stepping toward him. "You are holding back. You are still trapped by the idea that you are merely human." Ethan wiped the blood from his lip. "And what if I am?" The being's eyes burned. "Then you will die." A low growl escaped Ethan's throat. He pushed himself up, his entire body radiating frustration. The jungle blurred around him, his pulse hammering against his skull. And then, something snapped. The ember inside him roared to life. Heat surged through his veins, but it wasn't painful, it was powerful. His vision sharpened, the world around him suddenly more vivid. He could hear the rustling of leaves, the distant hum of insects, the faintest vibrations in the earth beneath his feet. The being moved again, raising its hand for another attack. But this time, Ethan was faster. He twisted to the side, dodging the blast before it could hit him. And before he even thought about it, he moved, closing the distance between them in an instant. His fist shot forward, aimed directly at the being's chest. But the being caught his punch. Energy crackled between them, the sheer force of Ethan's strike sending shockwaves through the ground. The being's eyes gleamed with something that almost resembled approval. "You are awakening," it said. Ethan exhaled sharply, his pulse still thrumming with raw energy. He could feel it now, the power. It was real. It had always been real. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. He was ready. The Virex were coming. And this time, he would be waiting. The night sky was restless. Dark clouds churned above, illuminated by the flickering glow of distant fires in the jungle below. The wind carried the scent of scorched earth, and the metallic tang of energy weapons, a reminder that the Virex were closing in. Ethan stood at the edge of the clearing, his fists clenched, his breath steady despite the chaos unraveling around him. He had spent his whole life fighting battles, but nothing had ever felt as important as this moment. The beam stood beside him, silent as ever. It had watched him train, guided him as his powers awakened, and now it observed him with an almost unreadable expression. Ethan knew what was coming. The Virex were not simply hunting him anymore. They were here to end him. A low hum filled the air, followed by a sharp crackle of energy. The first Virex scout emerged from the darkness, its red eyes glowing like embers in the night. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the jungle was teeming with them, their sleek armored forms blending seamlessly into the shadows. Ethan exhaled. His entire body was thrumming with energy, his muscles coiled like steel wires. He wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The first Virex lunged, its blade extending from its wrist in a flash of silver. Ethan moved, not with hesitation, not with thought, but with instinct. His body blurred forward, his hand catching the Virex's wrist in midair. The alien barely had time to react before Ethan twisted, sending it crashing into the ground with bone-shattering force. Another attacker came from behind. Ethan spun, dodging the strike before driving his knee into the soldier's chest. The force sent the Virex flying backward, slamming into a tree with a sickening crunch. More came. Dozens. They swarmed like locusts, their weapons gleaming under the fractured moonlight. Ethan met them head-on. He didn't just fight. He moved. His speed was unnatural. His strength was beyond anything he had ever known. Every punch sent shockwaves through the air. Every kick shattered armor like brittle glass. The jungle became his battlefield, and he was a force of nature unleashed. A Virex soldier fired a pulse rifle in his direction. Ethan saw the blast coming before it was even fired. He shifted to the side, his body bending with impossible agility, and the energy bolt sailed past him, searing into the ground. In a blink, he was upon the shooter, gripping its weapon and crushing it effortlessly before sending the Virex crashing through the trees. The being watched from the sidelines, its expression unreadable. But Ethan could feel its presence, feel its approval. He was no longer the same man who had crash-landed on this world, who had once doubted himself. He had become something else. And the Virex knew it. They hesitated now, their movements faltering. For the first time, they were uncertain. Ethan could feel their fear. But then, a deep guttural roar split the night. The ground trembled. The remaining Virex soldiers stepped aside as something massive emerged from the jungle. Ethan's breath caught for a brief second as he took in the towering figure before him, the Virex commander. Its armor was thicker, darker, pulsing with an eerie blue light. Its eyes burned like molten fire, and its body was nearly twice the size of the others. It carried no weapon because it was the weapon. Ethan exhaled, rolling his shoulders. His body still burned with power, but this opponent was different. The commander stared at him, unblinking. And then it spoke. "You are an anomaly." Its voice was deep, reverberating like a storm rolling through the sky. A mistake that should have been erased long ago. Ethan tilted his head. "Funny. I was just thinking the same thing about you." The Virex commander didn't waste time with words. It moved, faster than anything Ethan had encountered before. 1 second it was standing still, the next it was upon him, its fist colliding with his chest like a meteor. Ethan flew. The impact sent him crashing through trees, the force rattling his bones. He hit the ground hard, rolling several times before coming to a stop. Pain flared through his ribs, but he forced himself up. The commander was already there. Another blow came, a downward strike aimed at his skull. Ethan barely managed to dodge, rolling to the side as the ground exploded where he had been standing moments ago. This thing was strong. Stronger than him. He wasn't sure. But he was about to find out. Ethan surged forward, his fist colliding with the commander's midsection. The force sent a shockwave through the air, but the Virex barely staggered. Instead, it grabbed Ethan by the throat, lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. Ethan struggled against the iron grip. He could feel the edges of his vision darkening, but deep inside him, the ember of power still burned. No, not an ember. A wildfire. With a roar, he let go of everything. Fear, doubt, hesitation. The energy within him exploded. A shockwave burst from his body, sending the Virex commander flying backward. Ethan hit the ground, gasping for air, but he didn't stay down. He pushed forward, closing the distance in an instant. Before the commander could recover, Ethan's fist slammed into its chest with the force of 1,000 storms. The impact sent the Virex crashing through the trees, its massive frame tearing through the jungle like a wrecking ball. Ethan didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He was beyond exhaustion, beyond limits. He was the storm now. The commander tried to rise, but Ethan was already there. He grabbed the Virex by its armor, lifting it off the ground. "This ends now," Ethan growled. And with one final strike, one final surge of raw, untamed power, he sent his fist through the commander's chest. The Virex let out a guttural sound, almost a whisper, before the light in its eyes flickered and died. Its body went limp, collapsing onto the ground in a heap of ruined metal and flesh. Silence. The remaining Virex soldiers stood frozen, staring at their fallen leader. Ethan turned to them, his body still glowing with residual energy, his breath steady. "Leave," he said, his voice like steel, "or you'll end up like him." For the first time in their history, the Virex retreated. One by one, they faded into the jungle, vanishing into the darkness. Ethan stood there for a long moment, his body still humming with power, his mind still processing everything. The being finally stepped beside him. "You have done what no one else has," it said. "You have made them afraid." Ethan exhaled. He had won, but this was only the beginning. The Virex would return, but next time he would be ready. Because he wasn't just Ethan Carter anymore. He was something else, something the Virex feared. And for the first time in his life, he knew exactly who he was meant to be.